All right, our next topic for this unit is voluntary migration. So we've been talking about migration in class, and today we're going to focus on voluntary migration, which are essentially uh, instances in which migrants choose to migrate to a place. So we're focused in on the bottom bullet point that says types of voluntary migrations include transnational, transhumance, internal, chain, step, guest, and rural to urban migration. So we're going to get into each of those um, and talk about them. All right. So, like we said, involuntary migrations, migrants weigh the push factors and the pull factors of various places, and they decide to immigrate to a new place. And one thing to keep in mind as you are thinking about where people migrate to is the concept of distance decay. So, we talked about this when we talked about cultural diffusion, but distance decay basically tells us that closer places have more interactions than places that are further away. So, some things to keep in mind obviously, the size of the place. So, more people might migrate to New York City than to, say, Missoula, Montana from Seattle, just because New York is much bigger. But in general, the general concept will tell us that people are going to migrate to places that are closer um, in more, in stronger patterns of migration than they will to places that are further away. So you can see this graph sort of tells you the connection between increasing distance and the intensity of migration patterns. So that is to keep in mind. And this is an example of that. So we see migration to and from Salt Lake City within the United States. And you'll see in this map that the areas in and around Salt Lake City have a much darker pattern than places that are further away. So you can definitely see some examples of people moving to different places from Salt Lake City that are far away. But in general, the counties in and around Seattle are much more likely to be sources of inbound migration or outbound migration from Salt Lake City. Either people going to Salt Lake City, which would be inbound migration, or people leaving it, which would be outbound. So distance decay is the relationship between where people move or migration patterns and location. And it follows the same general principles as cultural diffusion, distance decay. All right, so rural to urban migration. So we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the migration transition model. So rural to urban migration is oftentimes a phenomenon related to the demographic transition of a country. So countries oftentimes in stage 2 or stage 3 in which we see population growth, we see lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of rural to urban migration. So I think the largest migration in human history has taken place in China over the course of the last 30 years and has essentially been the rural to urban migration from rural parts of China to the urban core of China. So that coincided, not surprisingly, with China's demographic transition. We're seeing similar things across the world in less developed and developing countries today. So I believe India is kind of an example of where this is taking place now. You're seeing the rise of mega cities within India and the rise of lots and lots and lots of very, very quickly growing cities throughout India. Lots of migration to the southern kind of core of India and other cities in and around India. And where we might continue to see this in the future is Africa. So we know the effects of population growth are probably going to be most felt in Africa over the course of the next 15 to 20 to 30 years. And this is a map that projects where we will see kind of large cities within Africa. So we've already started to see the rise of megacities within Africa. And what's interesting is we will increasingly see rural to urban migration as a product of a lot of individual countries going through their own demographic transition within Africa. All right. So rural to urban migration, oftentimes associated with the second or third stage of the DTM, and has led to the rise of megacities across the world in our sort of increasingly urbanized world. So some other concepts to keep in mind as we're talking about voluntary migration. So this is a term that is in the news a lot, chain migration. And it's also oftentimes called family-based migration. But I prefer chain because family-based doesn't, to me, get the entire picture of it all. But chain migration is the migration of people to a specific location because relatives or members of their community previously migrated there. So essentially, one person from a family or a community goes to a new place. They establish some sort of connection to that place, and then that encourages subsequent migration from members of that community or family. So oftentimes we see that with entire locations. So you'll see parts of the country that are associated with an ethnicity in many ways because we have patterns of movement to that individual place. So on the top map, you'll see these are places that have heavier Irish populations. And not surprisingly, the area in and around New York City and in and around Boston are the biggest communities of Irish Americans still to this day. And on the bottom, we have Asian migration. So you'll notice the West Coast is oftentimes where we see migration from individual countries within Asia. So this can be kind of where people live as a large cohort, or it can also, some examples can be within cities where people move to and live within cities. So examples of chain migration within individual cities are what we call ethnic enclaves. So things like the International District in Seattle or Chinatowns and other parts of town, Little Italies and all sorts of individual districts in which that essentially have been created as an ethnic enclave. And you'll even see some towns associated with this. So Ballard, Poulsbo are both associated in and around Seattle with Scandinavian heritage. German heritage is kind of Leavenworth's calling card. So you see this in and around the Seattle area a good deal. But these are all examples of chain migration, and I think help us understand why people like to move to places that have been essentially established within a new place, right? Common language, common religion, common ethnic and cultural heritage, all of that might serve to encourage more migration. So, and this is an example of this concept within the city of Toronto within Canada. So you have kind of a breakdown by neighborhood of immigrants from different parts of the world. And you can see kind of how that breaks down within the city. All right, another concept is called step migration. We're probably not going to spend quite as much time on this one, but step migration is when you have migration that follows a series of stages or steps toward a final destination. So the example that I like to give is the recent Syrian refugee crisis and migration into Europe. Followed some pretty interesting kind of determined patterns often, kind of migratory routes. And the one on the top right-hand corner shows that. And you had people sort of settling and migrating to these places and oftentimes settling in individual countries along the way, depending on how difficult the journey the whole time was. And the other example that I give is the recent migration from Central America to the United States. You had a lot of people migrating through similar paths in Mexico and some of them settling along the way in Mexico. All right, so the last big thing we're going to talk about are guest worker programs. So guest worker programs are a specific type of voluntary migration rooted in a lot of economic push factors and pull factors of individual countries. So essentially, it's when people from poorer countries are allowed to immigrate temporarily to more developed countries in order to obtain jobs. So the interesting clarification between other types of economic immigration is oftentimes they are not granted citizenship of the country in which they're migrating to. They are allowed to stay there and work there in a kind of a temporary or a legal status, or a legal status, not an illegal status. So a lot of the push and pull factors for this have to do with economics and with demographics. So as we talked about in the last unit, a lot of countries in more developing parts of the world have some demographic issues with kind of an aging workforce and with not enough people to support their population. So many of the ways in which this is alleviated is through these sorts of programs, with having guest workers or increasing amounts of economic immigrants to kind of fill that void within the country. And on the flip side, a country that's going through their demographic transition might not have enough economic opportunities for everyone within the country, especially in the younger age ranges. So you can see two population pyramids, one of them from Nepal, the other one from the UAE. So the Nepal one is up in the top right-hand corner. UAE is on the bottom, and you can see the effect of guest worker programs and large amounts of economic immigration. Kind of the dent in Nepal's pyramid and the bulge in the UAE's pyramid. So some important connections as it works kind of with guest worker programs. You see a lot of guest worker migration programs from South Asia to the Middle East. So from countries like India and Bangladesh and Nepal into more developed and sort of booming Middle Eastern cities, places like Dubai and Doha, Qatar, have a lot of economic opportunities for workers um, from Southeast Asia to China and from the Middle East and Africa to Europe. So those are kind of examples of guest worker connections that exist between different parts of the world. So guest worker programs can have lots of economic benefits, but also some downsides too. So we'll talk about each of those. So benefits there are economic benefits for host and source countries. So they essentially connect people who need jobs with people who need workers, right? And there are tons and tons of benefits to that. They can alleviate demographic issues in both countries, like we talked about before. And what happens a lot of times is people that go to new countries work there, get money, and then send it home to their families or their communities. And that is called a remittance. And this is actually a really important source of economic development for people in less developed and developing countries. It also can lead to enriching cultural and economic opportunities for everyone, right? When there are new people mixing and having acculturation occur and interesting synthetic cultures being created and kind of new things being created. And then some of the downsides to these programs. For me, the one that comes to mind the biggest is that it can result in abuse due to lack of regulations and political power. And we see this a lot, especially with the South Asia to Middle East migration stream of guest workers. The lack of regulations and poor treatment is pretty widespread, and it can lead to a lot of big problems. Also, cultural, political, economic conflict within the new country. So oftentimes these new migrant workers or guest workers are not met with universal approval by the people within the new country they're going to. Can lead to what's called brain drain, essentially the loss of talent and educated workforce and kind of young, vibrant workforce for a developed or less developed country, right? Can lead to just a general loss of talent. And then for the developed country, oftentimes some of this migration is not as popular because money might actually leave the country in the form of a remittance. So instead of being reinvested locally into the country, it's sent home to another country, which has a lot of benefits, but maybe not for the host country as much. All right, and one last thing to say about remittances is I actually think this is really interesting because remittances are a much bigger part of the world global economy than you would think. So $625 billion sent home by migrants to their home countries. And you can see the effects on some interesting individual countries as well. All right, thanks.